It's just
true.
me writing the world the way that I want it.
That's fair.
Is that retcon? That's like the definition of retcon.
That's the definition. Yeah, I wasn't gonna tell you, but you got there. So,
Hey everyone, welcome to the Bardic Tales of Dahlia. I'm Austin, joined by my friend Sarah.
I'm Sarah, long-term player in Austin's campaign.
And we're definitely not talking about problematic storytelling. It's
That's
fine.
actually entirely what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, it's not really problematic. It's just that, like, I made that world when I was in high school, and I want to change it a little bit. But I love the world because I love the world that I built. So I'm allowed to retcon things the way that I want to, okay? It's mine.
Anyway.
A very famous author did it to his own side character in his stories, okay? Don't even at me. All right? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the Sherlock Holmes series, and one of the books, Watson gets shot in the arm, and then in the next book, his leg has a limp. Like, he literally didn't care and just did it anyway. Like,
Funny, I didn't know that. That's great.
isn't it funny? It's so good, and they explain it away in the newest like Sherlock show or whatever, as it
That's
being
really
like
funny.
PTSD related or whatever. But like, it's really funny to me at least.
Please
So hey,
throw in
authors retcon stuff all the time. I mean, J.K. Rowling
Please.
does it, but we don't really count those. So
who?
J.K. Rowling does it all the
Who?
time, but we don't really. Good call. All right. Anyway, we're completely off topic. We are going to be here talking about the Fisher King, and as it relates to my story. So, a brief introduction is, I suppose, the Fisher King was the long-standing villain for the first campaign, and Sarah has some opinions on him. I'm gonna go ahead and start drinking my drink that I've got here, and she can just talk for a couple minutes.
So, the Fisher King was initially the main villain of Campaign 1, whose story was very twisty in a lot of different ways. But he was, I hesitate to call him the quintessential bad guy, because he definitely didn't come off as, this irredeemable asshole. He was pretty interesting, I thought, even from the beginning, with his motives and what he wanted and how he meant to achieve his goals. But throughout Campaign 1, he was, he was the big bad evil guy. He was the one we were trying to kill, and eventually did.
Twice.
At least once. Yeah, twice.
3 times, something like that.
And he's continued now on into the second campaign. Not so much as a villain. I'd hesitate to call him an anti-hero even, but he's definitely some sort of antagonistic force. And
he is an antagonistic NPC.
Yeah, and as my character has followed from Campaign 1 now into Campaign 2, she especially hates his fucking guts for a number of reasons, both related to the first campaign and as has come about in some backstory that filled in the gaps between Campaign 1 and 2, and then with some actions that have actually happened in Campaign 2. And it's kind of come to the point where this NPC, this fictional character that Austin has created, is the bane of my existence, and I have a lot of hatred for this NPC, which is probably the sign of good storytelling. So it worked out.
Maybe, yeah. So one thing that everyone kind of talks about for villains, especially like the DM's Guide has an entire chapter on this, like creating villains and going over like the different pieces and points of them. One big thing you should always do for a villain is give them a motive, right? Like some villains look at things like they want more power. Hence the villain of Campaign 2 currently, his big goal is power. And some go after money, some go after maybe they're after like winning an award of some kind, or like recognition basically, or they want to be redeemed in their own eyes, or look at a good villain from other stories where like Thanos, right, from like the Infinity War saga and everything, um, his motivations are set in stone. Like, you know them almost right from the get-go, at least in Infinity War, right? And that's what makes a good villain, is because they have something that they're working towards, and they don't seem like a blind force that just happens to be against the good guys. And I had determined really early on that he had motivations in the first campaign, but they always sort of changed, and eventually it was realized that his motivation was something that you don't see very often, which is just spite.
Yeah, he's just a dick.
He's just an asshole. Like, he lives to be a bad person to very specific people, one of them being Tajari. Like,
yeah,
who just he just likes to screw with.
To put it in perspective, one of the great things he did in the backstory between campaigns 1 and 2 was he killed Devious, who we talked about last episode, who was Tajari's love interest, killed him in front of her just to see the look on her face. For no other reason than just to piss her off. It worked. It worked very well. I'm gonna murder your NPC, Austin.
That's fine. So I think this episode was to highlight a big part of his story and kind of go through everything. So the one thing I wanted to talk about, and something that you don't really know too much about, is that he has a big story before even leading up to the actual campaign 1 itself. Like, campaign 1 had we played it for years and years, and it had its problems. And what we wanted to do when we started this podcast, we were going over the lore of it. We were going over, what happened in the first campaign, talking about the characters. Like, last time we had gone over the characters that were in the first campaign that we have as, like, quote unquote, the canon party, right? And that's the same thing with this campaign, where, like, we are going over the canon storyline, and that canon storyline being the entirety of the Fisher King story. Now, we did a lot of other things that we talk about and we joke about, and they're almost just, as far as, like, story goes, it's almost like the Star Wars legacy stuff, where they just kind of like, this isn't really canon, this is just stuff that is there and it exists. It's very similar to that. So, but something that I don't know too much about, but in the early stages of the Fisher King story, I had written him a bit of a background to be a good villain. So he is the oldest son of King Arathmus, the old king of Jermalo. And one thing about him that not a lot of people know is that he had 2 siblings, a younger brother and a younger sister. So we have since discovered, in character at least for campaign 2, that the sister lived to have children, even though he tried to kill her, and we'll get to that later. The brother, however, was somebody who was sort of like daddy's favorite, basically, which is the reason why he always had this motivation of spite. He had always kind of looked at his brother with this just hatred for always being basically the Faramir to the Boromir, in a metaphorical sense, right? And this is the reason why his motivations changed from wanting to do good to wanting to prove that he was more than his dad ever saw him as. Which, in and of itself, is tragic, despite the fact that that is not an excuse for doing all the things that he did. So,
yeah, I mean, I mean, one of the things that makes a good villain is complexity.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, you can have a villain that just is evil for evil's sake and is bad and but when you look at the villains people either love to hate or get endeared towards, when you look at, just to name some off the top of my head, Severus Snape, Loki, I guess Boromir isn't a bad example. He wasn't really a villain, but he did some things that people weren't too pleased with. Being misunderstood is a real draw for a lot of people, and and what misunderstanding really means is being complex. And this is an issue with the alignment system, but no person, as a general rule, thinks what they are doing is evil. Most people who do what we would be considered, bad, they're doing it thinking they're doing the right thing. So putting in complexity, making your characters, your villains, dynamic, making them misunderstood, or making them have these tragic stories that have, that's the reason they are the way they are. I mean, it makes a good villain. It makes a villain that's interesting, and it makes a villain that your players really love to hate.
Yeah, it's exactly what builds a good villain. I mean, this is something that we will talk about further when we eventually get into the story of Campaign 2, but a very prime example and something that I wanted to hit home with is that not every villain has to, like, alignment-wise, in the D&D sense of the terms, alignment-wise, not every villain has to be evil.
Yeah.
Like,
absolutely.
That is something that I think a lot of people, I don't know if a lot of people do it, but I think I've seen enough villains that are just quote unquote like they're always aligned evil, and I think that's wrong, because just because they are the antagonist does not mean that they're a bad person necessarily. Looking at Campaign 2, Act 1, the villain for Act 1 is a character known as Brom Morn, who alignment wise is lawful neutral. He is not evil. He specifically followed and did things to what he believed was like the law, and he followed them to a T, whether they were his own laws or the laws of the land. And that made him into the villain because of the actions that he did. He still believed that he was doing good. And I think that's a dynamic that a lot of people don't really look at villains in the limelight that they probably should be. I think a lot of villains probably would align less on the evil side than they actually are, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, evil is, it's kind of a low-hanging fruit of villains. Certainly it's I won't say easy, but it's obvious to do a villain that has very clearly evil motivations, but
it's very cliche.
It's cliche, and yeah. I'm a big fan of cliche. Taj is a walking cliche, but
she really is.
Don't attack me. Only I can attack me. And cliches aren't bad, but you can make interesting villains, and personally, villains that I think are more memorable than just someone who is, a Voldemort or a, quintessential bad guy. When you make them complex, when you make them, the Fisher King, for example, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is chaotic neutral.
He is chaotic neutral, yeah.
And that, it has nothing to do with him being evil. It has everything to do with everything else about him. And that, it's more memorable, it's more interesting, and it's certainly led the Fisher King to be one hell of a continuing villain and NPC in general. So
yeah, speaking of continuing, we can just kind of kick into his story. He showed up a number of times throughout the campaign, not just being he was never always the big bad guy. I think that's something that I've always done with storytelling, and I've done it with Campaign 2 as well, where there were different villains for different parts of the story, but there was always this one overlooming bad guy, right? It was very MCU of me to do so, where each villain from each of the Avengers movies got bigger and grander each time until they realized, oh, it's Thanos, right? Where we're in this, it was okay, you're starting to realize these smaller villains are doing things for the machinations of this one person who shows his face occasionally. I always have that villain kind of working in the background, and I think it works really well, especially for a long-standing campaign where you're looking at these smaller villains and kind of wondering why all these things are happening, and then eventually, it leads up to big villain who's doing pulling all the strings.
Well, and it makes a more cohesive story.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, you look at, I mean, just since we're kind of on the roll with the Marvel comparison here, if you look at all the Marvel movies separate, each villain in each movie is great. Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's some of the best movies that, you know, have come out in recent times. But they are given more meaning in this grander context of Thanos.
Mm-hmm.
And when you connect all the pieces together and you realize certain events and certain things aren't just because. You know, certainly there are movies like that, but then there are others that are definitely like, oh, this is leading up to something greater. It's it draws you in, and it makes a better story, and it's less disjointed. You know, one of the things that I do see in some campaigns, and I think is a bit of a learning curve, is this want to make these disjointed villains because everybody wants to fight the cool bad stuff that Wizards has put out that's in, you know, the player's handbook and the monster manual and this, that, and the other thing. But it ends up leading to a bit of a disjointed story if you're not kind of planning out ahead of time, okay, how are these all working together? And if they aren't working together, what is the situation that has led to the involvement of this other entity? And I think it's this whole idea of, you've got to remember that your NPCs live in the world too, and anything that your PCs are experiencing as the world changes, your NPCs, and, you know, whether you have an evil culture or, you know, you adhere by the evil, you know, race trope with drow and etc., they're going to be affected by this too. So it's this whole idea of having a dynamic world and a world that's changing with your big bad. So, you know, having your villains interconnect like you do, Austin, and like you're talking about, is hugely beneficial to immersion for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it helps build a world and makes it feel like, because don't get me wrong, I've played in campaigns and I've seen good campaigns where, like, the whole idea is, you know, you like work for an adventurers guild and you go out and you fight different things and you do, you know, the monster of the week style storyline, and like those stories work, like they can at least. But like, even if you look at, for example, one of the most famous monster of the week TV shows, Supernatural, right? If you look at that, where even though they had a different monster every single week, there was always an overarching story in between seasons or multiple seasons at a time. And like, it's because it creates a grander story. It makes sense that all of these small things kind of slowly build up to this bigger thing. And like, it's what makes a story flow naturally. And if you're going to build a campaign around a story, then you should. Where like that's how you should. Not necessarily how you should, but like, this is a good way to write it because it creates that good flow of the story. Because what you want to do when you're writing a good story is you want to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you need to have the build up to that climax of the story, and then you need to have like the actual ending to it. Like, everything needs to go in perfectly for a story-driven campaign to work. And it's different if you want just a dungeon crawl, right? Like, if that's what you want, that's what you want. And if you want to play a game of D&D where there's nothing but like the nitty gritty, you're paying attention to the amount of arrows that your ranger has, or the amount of rations that you have going into a travel, like, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it's not going to be as, like, if you're going to do story driven, you need to do it a different way, basically.
Yeah. No, absolutely. There are many ways to play D&D, and they are all valid, but if story is what you're going for, you kind of got to approach it.
Yeah, exactly.
A little differently.
And when it comes to this podcast, I mean, that's definitely something that I think we kind of advocate for, and something that we kind of push forward, is that we are specifically referring to campaigns that are more story driven versus anything else.
Yeah.
So speaking... Our literal first episode was called Collaborative Storytelling. So, I mean, yeah.
So getting kind of back to the whole idea of the villain's beginning, middle, and end. So with the Fisher King,
Mm-hmm.
He had a lot of beginnings that really I don't think we explored too terrible much in campaign 1 with his backstory.
Nope.
We didn't much get there, but his story in campaign 1 and how he moved alongside the party was certainly different and interesting, even from the get-go.
In the very beginning of the campaign, after a few the party had played through a number of smaller sort of side stories, much like mini parties do. And then, one of them involving a cow and a farm that got burned down and lots of like various just fuckery, honestly. But
I think fuckery is a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's just a good way to put it. Eventually, it led into the opening act for the Fisher King. And the opening act was actually something that I had stolen from a TV show. And which I think is another point. If you, as a DM, feel afraid to steal something from something, like something you're a fan of, whether it be a TV show, a movie, a comic, a board game, a card game, a video game, anything, don't be afraid to do it. Because one thing that it does is, first off, everyone does it. So don't feel afraid to do it, because literally everybody does it. It's so hard to have like an original idea nowadays.
There are no original ideas. There's just new retellings of stories.
Exactly. And like my campaigns very specifically, even my world, I mean, my map is like my own, but like the design of it and stuff is stuff that I have taken from various places and stacked together, right? Like even some of the names I've taken from like other places. Like it is one of those things where you can look at a bunch of different things and put them into a world. And one thing that shows as a DM, and I think it was you who told me this at one point, but it is kind of like looking at a DM's scrapbook of all of his like their favorite movies, TV shows, video games, all that stuff, like all jammed into one. And like, it's exactly like a good way for you to say, yeah, this is mine. Like, this is my campaign. This is my world. This is my story, because I put all my favorite stuff in there, and then I got all my favorite friends to look at it and play through a game with it. Right.
And it's important to note that even Wizards, if you look, I believe it's in the back of the DMG, there is about 2 pages of material where it says like, here's books and movies and media that you should use for reference
or inspiration or anything.
Inspiration. Yeah. It is okay to steal other people's ideas, because I'll tell you, chances are your players won't notice.
True.
Unless you're very, very obvious.
Unless you're obvious. So I mean, so I'll give 2 examples to this before we really kick off the Fisher King thing. One example that I have is that I took 2 things from Critical Role, 2 characters from Critical Role, and the only reason that people know one of the characters is from Critical Role is because I specifically told them. Yeah. The other one was extremely obvious. Like, in my campaign, there is a shopkeep known as Gilmore, who many Critical Role fans will know as Gilmore of Gilmore's Glorious Goods. And he is not only a very important NPC for Campaign 2, he is even a bigger NPC in Campaign 3, or at least he will be. Which, spoilers, that means he survives, so I'm sorry to spoil that part of the story for you. There is another character, however, that I've taken from Critical Role named Jarrett. Now, many in
he's from Critical Role?
Yeah, he is.
I didn't know he was from Critical Role!
Jarrett is a guard
proving the point.
Who helps guard their castle, or their keep, in the first campaign of Critical Role. And I only took the name and the design of him using a crossbow. Literally everything else is different in my campaign. It was like the basic idea, and then I was like, okay, ran with that, did other things. Okay, cool. Now he's mine, right? And like the same goes for Gilmore. I had a basic idea of a shopkeep who sells a bunch of fantastic items, and he talks like he's very flamboyant and he loves himself. And he's, very kind of, he does things for himself, whether it be for money or lifestyle choices, and he's wonderful. But like outside of that basic premise, I made him into his own character. He's very different in my campaign than he is in Critical Role. And we'll get into that much later when we actually talk about him. And so, like, if it was ever to a point where I would, sit down and like write a book or write or publish anything in Dahlia, right? I would probably change his name just for like posterity's sake. But like in the game, currently he is just Gilmore.
Yeah, and he's specifically Gilmore Briarwood as opposed to Sean Gilmore.
Correct. There is a name difference. The only similar name being Gilmore. Yeah. And so that's just like, that's two examples, and like I think were good examples, because you had no idea that Jarrett was from Critical Role either.
I had no clue.
And like that's just one of those things. Like you can take things from different places. I've taken monster ideas. I've taken NPC ideas, adventuring ideas, all that kind of stuff from different things. And so when we, flashing back to like the Fisher King story, the very first introduction, his opening act was a story from the end and then beginning of season 1 and 2 of Criminal Minds. It is a setup of each of the party members is doing their own thing. They're off kind of on like beach episode style things when they all get packages sent to them via a courier. And each of the packages is a different piece of different riddles. And that was another thing too about the Fisher King. Loves riddles. Absolutely loves them, which is the reason why we haven't done a lot of them in Campaign 2, because A, he's not the big bad, but B, a lot of the party members aren't big on riddles. Whereas in the first campaign, we had a lot more people that were into them, so it made more sense to do a bunch.
I for one love riddles and hate the character that gives them, so I'm here for it.
I love riddles. Anyway, so they were all sent different riddles. One of them was like a key. Another one was a head in a box. A number of different pieces of paper. A number of different, all these type of things. And eventually it led them on this just scavenger hunt to find a girl that had gone missing. And it felt weird to them that the king himself, King Erasmus, had given the party this as like finding out, oh, this might be connected. Please go find this girl. And it's because of the end of the story of this sort of opening act. King Erasmus had revealed, oh, this is actually my bastard granddaughter of my son, who is the Fisher King. Obviously saying his real name there. And then the Fisher King reveals himself and says, well, I'm actually the true king, because thwack, shoots him with an arrow and says, now I'm the only heir, and then kills his brother, kills his daughter, and moves on. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of like a big opening of like very in-your-face style introduction to a villain. And the next time the party had encountered him, it had been months of kind of tracking him down and all this sort of stuff. They killed him. And it felt like it was over. And I think that's
not over.
I think that's what was very different. So the thing that they didn't realize when they were fighting him is that him at his point in his life was very different than him when they had just met him. And the reason for that being, he had taken one of the quote unquote infinity stones. They're called seals. In my world, there are 4 of them. But he had taken the time seal and had been traveling through time doing various things, causing issues, and it caused their paths to be reversed. Very River Song style, where the party was, first originally met him and then killed him at the end of his life and then fought him as he was getting older in his own story. They were getting younger and vice versa. And so it became this very kind of interesting time, fucked up storyline, but it had made for like a really interesting build for the character itself, because it allowed him to keep returning and recurring as someone who not necessarily got easier to fight, but the fights were different because he hadn't really evolved to how powerful he could have been at certain points. So, but
Yeah,
that was sort of the opening of his story.
Yeah, and I mean, it was one hell of a way to introduce a villain to, you know, I don't remember what level we were when we first killed him, but
It was like
I mean,
2 or 3.
It was
really
early
on.
and it was, you know, it definitely was this sort of like, all right, clear my hands, we're done, let's move on, and then suddenly he comes back, and you're like, oh no.
He came back, and he's still very powerful, and it was like, it was really interesting way for him, because like at the very end of his life, he was a lich. He was strong, powerful wizard who could do a lot of different things, but they were able to defeat him because he was frail, right?
Yeah.
And like that's where it got to, like the fight was always on equal ground, because while he was this really, really powerful person, he was always kind of growing older and weaker physically as they were kind of getting stronger. And so it just created this interesting way to have a villain's fight always feel epic, which is what I really enjoyed about it, because I really like epic boss fights. And his story itself was always more kind of like following the trail of clues to get to him versus actually just fighting him on all fronts and trying to thwart his every plan, like it kind of is in campaign 2. And campaign 2 it's very different.
Yeah, and the story definitely progressed in a number of ways of us trying to figure out how to thwart him. There were a lot of different, because I remember. So I guess maybe before I get off on that tangent, did we want to talk about the kind of solidified base story of campaign 1, kind of an overview sense?
The one thing I will say is sort of a caveat here is that this was a long time ago, so like some of these might have been told out of order for anyone who was listening or like who was playing during that time. But this is kind of what we're going with as far as the storyline goes. So like I had said, the original one was the opening act, the puzzles and the riddles and things. And then next up was you guys tracking him down for a while and then eventually killing him. That was like the next step. And then what had happened after that was it had been a while. There was a few things that had happened. A few characters had kind of come and gone when eventually you were locked up in prison.
Yes.
For like a very, like, I don't remember
3 years.
If it was
3.
You guys were in 3 years. I just don't remember if it was like exactly told like why you were locked up necessarily.
I think what we kind of came to assume was the Fisher King had kind of taken power and had tossed us in jail because he could.
Pretty much
was the assumption.
Again, the motivations of spite. So
yeah, and you know that 3 years wasn't played out in character, but that definitely was a turning point in the story for sure. So 3 years, three whole years.
3 years in prison when eventually a revenant named Wraith or Wrath. Maybe Wrath.
It was Wrath.
Who eventually he was working for the Fisher King when he basically came down to the party and was like, okay, so he's doing a lot of bad stuff and I don't really agree with it. And he's got it really out for you guys. So I'm going to set you free. So hopefully we can take him down together. And as like a basic gist of that story.
Yeah, that covers it.
But freed you guys. And, you know, after freeing you, grabbed a bunch of the Fisher King's journals and things of that nature and left. And for a while, you guys traveled with Wrath, kind of trying to translate and to interpret the journals that he had taken and kind of figure out how to subvert the power that the Fisher King had over Jermalo.
Right.
Which led to his tower.
Yes.
Which I don't know if the map that I had shown in the last episode of Jermalo has it. There is a small lake. I say small. It's fairly sized, but there is a lake under the Selway stronghold that has a tower on the very western shore. And I'll probably show it on screen at this point, but that tower is the Fisher King's Tower. It is one that he had, put up as his show of force and show of power that eventually was a sort of different dungeon crawl, I guess, as far as the party was concerned, because eventually those journals led you there. Yeah. And you guys went into the tower and found out that he was dead.
Yeah.
That he had been ruling from some sort of power or whatever for the last however many years, dead.
Yep.
And that's when eventually some weird powerful force, spectral force of some kind, knocked the tower over into the lake with you guys inside of it. Mm-hmm. That's also where your friend Hug Hug came in. And became not Hug Hug anymore.
He became Stab Stab.
He became Stab Stab.
And he
stabbed you.
And stabbed me to death. And I had to be brought back. I did, in fact, die. Woof.
Yeah. And eventually it just got kind of different, where after that, eventually coming back and kind of trying to follow the footsteps of the Fisher King and figure out what was happening. That's when I think people started to realize that his timeline was different.
Yep.
Where his timeline was kind of backwards. And because eventually it came down to you guys realizing that not only had time been really screwed up, and he had taken one of these seals, but he had already started taking some of the other ones as well.
Yeah, and it was then at that point when the goal very much turned to, we need to beat him to these seals and we need to learn more about them. And I don't really remember how much we truly understood them before we kind of started going down that route.
Well, the one problem is that a lot of his sort of helping villains, these sort of side villains and everything, really kind of got in your guys' way.
They did.
This is when you guys met the family of known as the Lockharts that had kind of tried to, well, for lack of a better term, they tried to turn everyone into vampires. Yeah. They also basically occupied the party for a number of months as you were trying to eventually get to one of the seals and found that it was gone. The same came with the Drow, who had gotten in the way and tried to invade Jermalo from the Underdark, which was kind of a big distraction and prevented you from taking the Lunar Stone. That's space? No. What's the opposite one of power?
I can never remember, because
I do not know.
For sidebar,
time. Yeah.
So the stones are, they have kind of two designations of their power, which is time, power, specifically power, reality, and space. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So they correlate to a couple of different things. First things first, they each correlate to a different Infinity Stone, although that was not necessarily intentional. When it was originally written, I had no idea what the Infinity Stones were. I was not a comic guy. Still not, really. I only know them from the actual like Marvel movies and stuff. But I had no idea that they had correlated so well to the Infinity Stones. But those were the four that we had taken. We had taken what is Mind, and what's the last one?
Well, we had time, space, power, and reality.
Yeah.
Are the four that we have, and they correlate each.
Oh, mind and soul are the two that are not, quote unquote, like in these seals. Yeah, so they didn't really like correlate as perfectly as I thought they would. Like they did really well, and I didn't really think they would. They also correlate to the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which is a big talking point to like what the Fisher King was trying to do. When you guys had started eventually gotten to the point where the last seal had to be broken, it was on the top of a tower known as Haratha, and in the Dunes of Dev, and going there to like get this final seal, Taj was told to do so. Yes.
So, this is kind of tying back in just to my character since I get to talk about her now. Taj's backstory was, from the beginning, wrapped up in this idea of starting the apocalypse. She didn't really know what that meant. She was basically told, go start the apocalypse so Asmodeus can, create this perfectly ordered world for everyone to live in by force. Mm-hmm. And what ended up happening is we get to the top of Haratha, where we get the power, we're trying to save the Power Stone, trying to keep the Power Stone out of the Fisher King's hands. And Taj is confronted with the, basically the idea of, and how I've always put it, is the big red button that you're not supposed to push, but Taj is told to go push. She doesn't push it. And that was the Power Stone is specifically associated with the Horseman War. Mm-hmm. It ends up getting pushed anyway.
It does.
And, yeah.
By someone who has yet to be named in character, so we're going to wait on that one.
But essentially it gets pushed by another agent of the Nine Hells who was sent knowing that Taj, or suspecting that Taj would ultimately fail at her goal.
Yeah.
And this is actually this point where it's been, okay, we understand that the Fisher King is going after these seals that not only correlate to something very apocalyptic, quite literally apocalyptic, but that these seals hold the fabric of this world together. They specifically correlate to, time, space, power, reality. They are what holds everything in place. Mm-hmm. And part of the reasons things are going sideways is because the Fisher King has removed them. And
there's one thing that we had explored in campaign 2 was that there's sort of two ways to interact with them. There is a safe way to interact with them that causes someone who becomes a seal bearer to take the seal upon themselves and attach it to their soul effectively, which means that when that person dies, they release the horseman unless the seal has been taken from them and utilized in some way. And we'll get into that later, much further down the road when we talk about campaign 2. But there's another way, which is just basically taking it or breaking it. And those always cause the cataclysmic events that come with the horseman, basically.
And that's essentially what had been happening. And unfortunately, we had gotten up to this point in the story where we had started to understand, okay, the seals are the problem. We need to protect them and gather them and figure this out. And unfortunately, it was shortly after that campaign 1, as being played, ended. Mm-hmm. So it was at that point that the party, or rather I should say the players, we went our different ways for a while, and there ended up having to be some filler that could take up its own episode, and probably will.
It's probably actually going to take up one of the next couple of episodes.
Yeah.
But story-wise,
it was.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say. So it was. It was definitely this final culmination of something huge that was all started with the Fisher King and what he was doing, and I think that was kind of the overarching idea of getting to this point in the story. Is it began with the Fisher King being, what is he doing? Why is his timeline weird? And it eventually culminated into these seals. And how we needed to interact with them and save them and etc. And that's kind of all that how all of that ended up tying in. And
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot that happened in the campaign as a whole that has certainly been glanced over a little bit, because I think it is fair to note this started 8-9 years ago
It's
is
forever
when
ago.
when this campaign
Almost
initially
9
started.
years ago.
And I think it's I don't think it's an unfair statement to say that I have changed as a player, and you certainly have changed as a DM in that time.
Mm-hmm.
And
we've changed as people, just in general.
And some of campaign 1 was perhaps a little disjointed. And there was a lot that definitely got skimmed over when it came to different ways we were trying to fight the Fisher King and trying to get to this penultimate goal of stop the world from falling apart.
The one thing that happened with me specifically as a DM was that earlier on, when I was in campaign 1, I didn't want the story to end, so I never ended it. And 2, I wanted the campaign to be focused on the story, but I don't know if I knew how to write a story. Like, I wanted all the cool things to happen, like all the D&D things where you fight the cool monsters and you go to the cool places and you do all that cool stuff. But what I didn't realize and didn't really know how to do at that time was how to kind of connect that creative story together. And that was like a big turning point for me when I eventually figured out how to do that. Where it kind of culminated into this campaign.
Yeah. And and that's, I guess, kind of where we're at now. Is campaign 2, which definitely has a little bit more of a everything feels a lot more connected and a lot more sequential, and there feels like there's an end where I definitely, it changed. And I mean, I think that's bound to happen. We've talked a lot about DM strategies and this collaborative storytelling, and I don't think it's a bad thing to kind of acknowledge that as a DM, you want your players to do the cool things, and you don't want your story to end, especially when you're talking about a homebrew world where it's your baby. It's something you've created. It's your story. But with all due respect in the world, your story has to end at some point, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where back then I didn't want the story to end because I thought maybe that meant that my friends stopped hanging out with me or we didn't play in that world anymore. Where I wanted that world to continue because I love that world, right? And that was almost like a separation anxiety style setup for me, where I just didn't want it to end because I wanted the story to continue forever. And
yeah, pro tip:
it's
end
not
your
good.
stories.
It's not healthy.
End your stories. It's not healthy for you. It's not healthy for your players. It causes problems.
Keep your players away from getting their cool ability at 13th level.
God, please.
Don't.
Yeah.
Just don't do that. Because, we constantly went back on, I would constantly be like, okay, we're starting at a new system. So we're either going from 4E to D&D Next to D&D 5th Edition to Pathfinder, whatever. And each time I would knock people back to a lower level so that we could build in that place a lot longer. And it became a mess.
It was a mess, and
I hated it. I hate everything that had happened during it, and I'm glad that we're now in a better place for it.
Yeah, for sure. Again, another episode that I'm sure we could go over with player DM conflict.
Originally, I think we sat down to do this podcast to go over all the lore of Campaign 1, but quite frankly, the problem with that is that neither of us remember much of Campaign 1 other than the big points. And I wonder if this podcast is going to be more about just telling the story through our eyes and talking about different pieces of the lore separately versus in a timeline fashion.
Well, and I think for this particular episode, kind of as we wrap up here, one of the goals with this podcast absolutely was, this is a huge world. This is a long-standing story with quite a bit of background that some of which has been played at the table, some of which hasn't, and hopefully this can act as a guide for either people who have played in the campaign, of which there have been many, or people who are going to be playing in the future, and, either want to catch up or want to have some background. But I think that this can definitely serve the secondary purpose of what not to do and what to do to make an effective story, because I certainly wouldn't be here 9 years later doing a podcast if this wasn't something I was heavily invested in. We talked about this in episode 1. I'm kind of a broken record at this point, but I guess that's kind of where I was going with that. Is
no, it's fine. And I think I think one thing I like, the ending of the Fisher King story, or at least quote unquote the ending as of right now, and where I want to kind of cut it off is that the very end of his story, he had the last quote unquote seal broken, and it kicked off an event that causes a lot of trauma for a lot of us when we talk about it. Specifically you, because
mostly me.
Your character was very big in it. But it kicked off an event known as the Endless War, which you can imagine is about as terrible as it sounds, because it is.
It is in fact a war that was endless.
Well, I mean, it ended. It just took 666 years. I mean, a war that lasts that long, though, is like, might as well be endless. Right?
I think Taj would argue that it's still going, but that's just me.
You are not wrong. So yeah, I think that's a big event, and it was something that really kind of kicked off everything. And one thing that Taj had said, like in character in campaign 2, when talking about the events of the Endless War, when talking about all of the different things that had happened, she had mentioned how out of everything that happened, the Nine Hells invading Dahlia, or Elysium sending its best warriors down to fight, the gods getting involved in each other, these people dying and lots and lots of lives lost and souls, taken from everywhere to be in this war. She had mentioned that only one person made it out net positive.
And that was the Fisher King. And this is why he is such an interesting villain, because this entire war he did, and this goes back to the motivations, he did it out of spite towards his family, towards the people who opposed him, and the entirety of the Endless War, which I'm guessing is going to be next week's episode.
Oh boy.
The entirety of the Endless War was all because of the Fisher King's personal drive to be an asshole. And
what a way to talk about a villain.
He's great. So I guess that's kind of
I had it in the last episode too, but I'm definitely gonna have a bunch of his different face claims that I've used over the years, including the one that you hate so much. I
hate that one. When this face claim was revealed, which I'm sure will be up on screen here shortly, when he dropped that face claim, I was mad. I was at work,
visibly angry at work.
I was at work and I was furious because this face claim is perfect.
It really is. It's just like this smug look on his face and everything.
It's a face you want to punch. Like
it really is a very punchable face. No offense to the artist who drew this, because again, I do not claim any of the art that we've used for any of this other than the art for the maps. Even the art of Taj that I used was one that you had commissioned, so it's not anything I own any sort of rights to or anything. So those artists, as much as I'd love to credit them, I don't have those artists from anywhere. So if anyone sees that art and is like, oh, that's from so-and-so, please point it out to me. I will give them credit, as much credit as needed. Because I'm not using that art I'm not trying to use that art for like financial or personal gain. It's just to show, like we use it as face claims, which I think is a very important talking point that we can go over at some point.
Whatever artist made this picture, whoever you are, wherever you are out there, thank you for making a face I hate, because
It's-
no single image has given me so much utter fucking loathing. And it's great.
It is the best picture for a villain I've ever used.
It's so good. So I guess kind of wrapping it up, kind of the takeaways is make your villains interesting.
Make them complex.
Make them complex.
Is a big point. Like, just making them have not only a backstory, because a lot of people give tragic backstories to their villains, but just like, not just a tragic backstory, but giving them a motivation, that is a little different, is definitely something that is going to make your villain stand out, but also make it so that motivation is why the party dislikes them.
Yeah, and it, like I said, the thing with the Fisher King is, or like you said rather, his motivation is spite. That's different. That's not, when you think motivations, you usually think powers, etc. But this one is one that has made a villain that I think I hate more than any other villain in any other piece of media I've ever consumed. So definitely choose your motivations wisely. And I think even more so, steal from other media. Do it.
All the things
I know you want to steal them.
Like, it doesn't matter. There are locations on my map that I've stolen from pieces of art in games that I play. There are places, there are like names of cities and regions and all sorts of things in my world that I've stolen from other places. Some of my dungeon crawls have been from other places. Just do it.
Do it as long as
it's fun.
As long as you're not profiting off of it, let me tell you, it's a lot of work to build a homebrew world. And steal from people who've already done it, and then you'll have a lot less to do later.
You'll have a lot of fun and a very big. Your players will thank you for having just this like way to describe to them, like, especially if they've seen it, or like you can describe this to them because they've also seen it, right?
Yeah.
And like it's so much easier to do so.
And it absolutely makes finding face claims, artwork, etc. way more accessible.
So much easier. Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess that's campaign 1. That's the story of the Fisher King.
That's the Fisher King's story, kind of leading up to his like penultimate event of the Endless War being his. What do they call it?
I don't know, his magnum opus.
His magnum
opus, yeah.
Yeah, that's
his
what
magnum opus, anyway.
Okay, jeez. Really? He had to sneak that joke in there? All right.
I had to sneak that joke in there.
That's going to be it for us. That's everything for this week. So, thank you guys for listening. We really appreciate it, and we hope you guys enjoyed this episode. We are going to sign off for the day and hope that you guys will come back again for the next one.
Have a good night, y'all.
Peace.
Fucking magnum opus.